All right, Jamon Moore here once again. Another pregame Aftershock coming up this Saturday, 7 o'clock, PayPal Park. The Colorado Rapids and the San Jose Earthquakes get to meet for the first time. And when I want to talk Colorado Rapids, there is nobody I want to talk to more than the one and only soccer rabbi, Mark Goodman. Mark, how are you doing? Welcome to the show. How's everything in Pittsburgh for you?
We're loving right. Your listeners are automatically confused because I cover the Colorado Rapids, but I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Well, I live in Seattle, and I was at the CCL game last night and covered the Quakes. So yes, the virtual world we live in.
Well, you understand. I mean, I think you and I are probably both the same to some degree, which is you fall in love with the team, and then you don't allow geography to mess with that. You know, you keep following that team and you keep loving it. We're good. I mean, the weather out here is phenomenal for once. So it's not raining today. Spring has sprung. It's not cold. I planted my garden. You know, I ain't got no complaints. Everything's good.
Everything's good. And well, are things good with the Colorado Rapids? Because I took a look at the table, sitting currently 8th, and that's just a goal differential technicality. So just one spot out of the playoffs. But 11 goals for, 11 goals against. But you also have some player changes going on here. So before we get into the player changes, talk to me a little bit about the season so far. What's gone well, and what do you think has room for improvement so far?
So it's been a bad run of form recently. They had 5 games without a win until the other day when they gave Portland a really good thumping. And in that really good thumping that they gave Portland, they picked up 2 yellows for Diego Rubio. His second yellow was, some argue that it was soft. I think that it was soft in the sense that, like, you know, it might have just been a foul normally, and it wasn't really a dangerous foul, but he went to ground and he got there late, and he rolled under the player. And when you do that, you're risking a second yellow. So, but before that, they just hadn't been very great. They'd beaten Atlanta, who's not having a very good season. Then they beat Sporting Kansas City, who's not having a very good season. And then they drew Houston, drew Salt Lake, lost to Dallas, lost to Minnesota, drew Charlotte, right? Which is like the original sin. Not to mix religious metaphors here, but like It's Charlotte at altitude for the first time in Colorado, and they went 0-0.
Right.
And it was the first game the Rapids had Gyasi Zardes. So there was a lot wrong at that point. I think the overall narrative that most Rapids fans believe in is that there was a lack of scoring bite up front. We did roughly around our expected goals to goals ratio was like 1-to-1, meaning we scored mostly the goals you'd expect us to score, but our finishing wasn't above average. It was very average. And that means a mid-table finish, right? Yep. And in addition to that, the formation the Rapids have been playing most of the season, me and Matt have referred to it affectionately as the 3-4-3 empty bucket. We rely on 2 central midfielders who typically do the deep sitting frontline defensive work, and then they ping that ball out wide. And it's been, I'd say, in our how many games we've played, like 15 or so, it's become a little bit stagnant. That the way we score is we come central, we go wide, we come central, hopefully the ball goes in. And that kind of avoiding zone 14, avoiding top of the box plays hasn't always been working out for us.
Yeah, that's a really fair point. And now without Rubio, who has 5 goals on the season and is leading the team, behind Rubio, Mark-Anthony Kaye is the only one with more than a goal on the season. Now, you mentioned Gyasi Zardes, and again, we're going to get to that here in a second, but or maybe this is the time to get into Gyasi. In Rubio's absence, what do you think that they'll do? How will they set up? And do you think like Gyasi is going to play from minute 1 in this game?
I think that's almost certain. The other options wide are speedsters. There's Michael Barrios on the right, who will typically invert some point midway the first half just to mess with people's minds. And
not Michael Barrios. I don't believe that for a second.
Yeah. He's a little CONCACAF-y also, so he loves to flop and dive a little bit. So keep an eye out for that, Earthquakes fans.
I think they're well aware of it.
Yeah. On the other side, you get Jonathan Lewis. He's a pure speed, very, very tricky dribbler into the final third. The finished product is not always there. So I think that's the big critic. And that's not just in goal scoring, but in like making the right cutback pass, the right pass at the right time, releasing the ball at the right moment. So those are the criticisms that Rapids fans have had. But I think the front three is pretty decent with this team. The other big problem, I'm less worried about missing Diego Rubio in this game than I am about missing Jack Price, who sustained a hamstring injury 2 games ago. And the Rapids have been really good / bad at communicating. They really like to keep, player personnel stuff close to the vest. And there's very few reporters going out to the field on a weekly basis, even post-COVID. But word on the street is probably the Price will not be ready for this game. That gives us fewer players in the midfield to mess with. That probably means you're going to wind up with Mark Anthony Kaye and Max, our Brazilian player, who all the Rapids fans are very excited about, but really has yet to kind of blossom. He had 1 goal in our first CCL game before we got eliminated, and I think that's pretty much all she wrote for Max.
Every MLS team needs that one name player. For the Earthquakes, there's actually kind of a couple. You have Nathan, the center back, who picked up a red card against Seattle, but should be back now for this one. And you also have Shofis. That's not really his name. That's actually a nickname, but everyone just gives him the one-word name, Shofis, even though Eduardo Lopez is the name that a lot of times you'll hear the announcers say. So now the Rapids have their own with Max, of course, Brazilian.
Yeah, and we have a mild concern that we just traded our only Portuguese to English speaking player on the team. So the Rapids are historically cheap. So there's been a lot of banter amongst our fans as to whether this is a major problem for Max, that the team is not going to bother spending the money to hire a translator. They've been relying on Andrei Shinyashiki to do all the translating, and now we don't have him anymore, so no one will know what Max is saying anymore.
Let's talk about Shinyashiki for a second, because I think, coming out of college, Denver University, I mean, he was a goal-scoring machine.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I liked him so much that I said publicly that the Quakes should do everything they needed to in order to land Shinyashiki. I thought he might be, a good, replacement for Wando eventually or something along those lines at the time. And, how do you look back on a player like that who came in with so much promise and sometimes did deliver on that promise, and at other times didn't seem to fully find his way within the team? But basically the team moved him for about the same price as they paid to get Gyasi Zardes in. So, how do you kind of look at that in hindsight in terms of his time in Colorado?
It's a great question. I've covered Shinyashiki since he was a junior at DU when I was living in Denver, and he's a wonderful player. I mean, you're spot on that he banged in a ton of goals for DU. He was the leading scorer in the NCAA 1 year.
Yes,
I believe his senior year. And he also was playing with the Rapids U23 team, which was, God, it's long enough ago that I don't remember. I guess it was USL2. It was a USL2 team. And I did an interview that I actually didn't wind up using with the U23 and the U18 head coach, whose name is Eric Boucher. He's now the Rapids 2 head coach. And I was waiting during training to interview him, and Shinyashiki was hanging off to the side because he hadn't been drafted by the Rapids. He was still playing for DU. He was basically doing summer league for fun to stay warm.
Right.
And I said, "Hey, you're Andrei Shinyashiki. I've watched you at DU. This was before his senior season." Right. I said, "Hey, what are you going to do after college?" And he looked at me dead serious, like I'd said something really offensive. And he said, "I'm going to play in Major League Soccer." And I was like, "Okay." And of course, he had an incredible season, and then he got drafted. So my take on him is he has a tremendous amount of drive, that he's a really, really driven guy. I think your analogy to Wando was spot on. He really does have that fox in the box,
Mm-hmm.
late arriving between the center backs, one-time goal into the back corner that Wando was fantastic for, that made him the greatest scorer in Major League Soccer. The thing that is also similar about Shinyashiki and Wando is patience, in terms of needing to have a team who will wait till he can mature and get really good at that kind of pop-up in the box, Thomas Muller sensibility. And I think that the Rapids didn't have that. I also don't think that their playing style really complemented that. The Rapids score most of their goals the last 2 seasons from set pieces. And what they really need is a guy who can rise up in the box on a corner and bang it in with his head. And that is not Shinya. He's really good with his feet. He's a pretty talented dribbler. He has a nice kind of drag motion where he can kind of cut across from a corner and take a shot from a wide angle. But he doesn't have 2 things that would have been valuable for him, which is flat out speed or physical size and height to rise up and bang it in with his head. That doesn't mean he won't be a huge scorer in Major League Soccer. That just means he needs to find the right team for that. And the Rapids have not been evolving in that direction for him, nor were they really giving him all that many chances. I mean, for a whole season, they played him at left wing, which he was okay at, but he wasn't great at.
Sure. Well, one of the there's a couple I think players that are kind of interesting for Quakes fans in particular. One of them being Steven Beitashour, who many just look at with great fondness from the 2012 Goonies year. But he's been able to kind of hang on and continue to be a part of this Colorado team. At this phase in his career, what can you tell Quakes fans about what you see from a player like Steven Beitashour and what type of contributions he's capable of continuing to provide to this Rapids team?
I think a lot of pundits like me started off with Beitashour and saw him a lot like Colin Warner, who the Rapids also have, as kind of like over 30, break glass in case of emergency, player that you put in second or third of the depth chart. Right. But we've really, Robin Fraser our head coach really seems to like giving veterans a chance and giving them the opportunity to go and reclaim that spot. And I have been surprised at the degree to which players like Colin Warner and Steven Beitashour have been given time on the field. We have had a few injuries at fullback. And additionally, the team kind of also moved Keegan Rosenberry inside. We had a couple of injuries at center back, and Keegan Rosenberry, our right back, has really good stay-at-home defensive sensibilities and can play center back in a pinch. And that meant that you needed Beitashour on the other side. So that's one thing about Beitashour. He hasn't really lost much speed. He can really still get up and down. And he gives you a slightly different look than our typical left back when he plays on that side, which is Lucas Estevez is our left back typically, because our other left back, Brian Galvan, tore his ACL to start the season and is out all year. So I would say we had more fullback depth and more center back depth, and we've lost it. And that's pressed Beitashour into service, but we haven't seen too much of a fall off. I think what you get from him is really good defensive cover and just a kind of a calm on the ball. What you lose is he just doesn't get as far forward as Estevez did. He doesn't have this flat out pace or the ball serving ability that Galvan had. And so I don't think, I think what it ultimately results in is a little bit what I said at the beginning of our team looking a little bit unidimensional, that we don't have as many offensive weapons to bring to the fight.
You and I are both people that look at the goals added, obviously, and you've written for American Soccer Analysis, as have I. It's sometimes a metric that can help us see the things that are not necessarily standing out all the time on the pitch. And one thing that I found was really interesting was Austin Trusty, who's going to apparently, be moving on here for a bit from the Rapids. Give us an update on his situation. But one of the things that really stood out to me was how much he has accumulated in a category that, the casual fan probably doesn't know a lot about, called interrupting. And he's a center back. And what a high interrupting stat can probably mean is that he's really kind of helping the team win the ball higher up the pitch in advantageous situations. Talk to me a little bit about, what you've seen from Austin Trusty that is giving him such high scores right now in this goals added category, and how you think the Rapids are going to be able to move on from him. I believe mid-season, he's supposed to be heading to Europe, correct?
Yeah, it's hard to tell. I find Austin Trusty. So last year, this is an interesting data point to know, because I don't expect you to look at every player's every year's results.
I don't.
for every team in the league, no less, right? But
right.
Last year, statistically speaking, from a G+ perspective, Austin Trusty was the worst defender on the team. And so I'm definitely skeptical or confused or something about what exactly is going on. The eye test tells you, for me anyways, that the Rapids backline is forced into work more often than they used to be, partially because of the formation they're playing, partially because of the personnel they have. So I think Sam Vines was with the team last year at left back, and I think Sam Vines was probably covering more ground and doing more at left back defensively. That meant that the guy next to him, aka Austin Trusty, wasn't called into service as often. Trusty's doing a really interesting role. So the other thing that Vines would do is Vines sallied forth a lot. He was a really high playing left back, and he also came central when he would come in offensively at left back, whereas most left backs who carry the ball up the field, they hug that line really nicely. Trusty's doing a lot of carrying the ball up from center back way into the attack, which is really interesting. And I think a lot of some of his interrupting is coming from either turning over the ball in the offensive end and then pressing immediately, right? That Trusty gets forward and tackles and takes the ball back. But the other piece is that he's just doing a lot of work back there and doing a really good job of it. And his battery mate, when he was healthy, was Danny Wilson, who's been exceptional for the last 2 years. And then next to him is Lawless Abubakar. And the three together are asked to do a lot of work. The last thing I'll say is this. Because of that empty bucket that I was talking about before, I think our two midfielders are sometimes asked to do other things. And so Trusty has to do a lot more of the quote-unquote interrupting in order to be in the system in a proper way. But I think all of it is basically, I think there's definitely an aspect, Jamon, where I look at the whole totality of the team, and I'm not entirely sure I understand all the pieces. And I know there's smarter soccer people out there who can look at the numbers and understand them. And I'm pretty sure the people at Arsenal have looked at Austin Trusty, what he does physically, what he does technically, what he does in terms of spacing, and have said, the numbers aren't lying. He really is a great player. He's still young. There's so much potential. This guy could be the guy. That being said, I'm 90% sure that Arsenal is going to pull a Manchester City and loan him out to some team in Belgium as soon as he gets there.
Yeah, it's a very common tactic for teams to do that and use that as an opportunity to see if what they are seeing in another place continues in a new place without them taking on a lot of risk to be able to do that. Mark, it's been excellent to have you. I like to get to a little bit on the personal side of things and also talk about your work here. So first, you've written for places like the Denver Post before. You've covered the Rapids for a very long time, and now you're involved with not to age you or anything.
We're old men.
I'm older myself. And also you're now engaged with Pittsburgh Soccer now, and then you're involved with a Substack called Holding the High Line. I see a lot you guys writing articles as well as producing podcasts. Talk to us a bit about your work, and then talk to us about this isn't a bit. You are a legitimate rabbi. I know some people may come on and go like, "Is this a bit? Is he really?" Is he just like? But no, you're a real rabbi. So talk to us a little bit about that and soccer in general and how you kind of blend the two.
Yeah, I came to soccer in a really funny way, just like probably most of your listeners, which is an interested fan. I moved to Denver in 2011 with my family, and hockey and football were too violent for me. I had little kids. I grew up in Los Angeles, California. I'm a major Dodger fan, or I was when I was younger. And so that meant that there weren't a lot of teams and I didn't really like the NBA. So there weren't a lot of teams I could root for. But one day I went on Jewish community night of all nights to the Colorado Rapids, and I just watched this guy on the ball dribbling beautifully. And his name was Lee Win. And he just dominated, and he looked fantastic. And he just had such a beauty and a poetry to the way he played. And having lived abroad in Israel for 2 years, having been someone who kind of like, always liked the World Cup. I went to the World Cup as a kid in '94, right? Like soccer always had a warm place in my heart, but I'd never had a team before. Because of course, you and I both remember that when we were growing up, MLS didn't exist. EPL wasn't on TV, right? Like there was just very little soccer to be in love with. Find, yeah. So anyways, I fell in love with the Rapids, and what happened was there was nothing to read. They weren't covered in the Denver Post. There was a one local blog. The one local blog had one regular writer, nobody else, right? And one day the blog sent out a thing, this is Burgundy Wave. They sent out a thing saying, hey, we're looking for writers. And I wrote something and they said, you're hired. And eventually over time, I became the assistant editor and then the temporary editor. And then I jumped to another website and then I jumped to another website. And then one of the other writers for the Rapids started a podcast, me and Matt Pollard. And that's called Holding the High Line. And now we're the longest running podcast on the Colorado Rapids. And we decided to start. Thanks, man. Don't have to be the best, just have to out-survive the rest.
Yeah, sometimes it works that way.
So yeah, and that, I just kept writing and really enjoying it. And it's a great release. As a rabbi, as a working rabbi, I have a small congregation in Erie, and I help out with a congregation here in Pittsburgh. It's very large. The process of being a rabbi is being a creative fountain all the time, just like looking at society and reflecting on it from a creative perspective of asking questions and thinking big thoughts and wondering why and telling the story, right? And none of that is any different from being a journalist or being a soccer fanatic, right? You want to know, like, why is Andre Shinyashiki moving on from Denver? How is Gyasi Zardes going to fit into this new formation? What is the American Jewish response to the latest, story about the repeal of Roe v. Wade, right? Like, it's all about gathering input, being creative, coming up with an interesting way of reflecting it and sending it back out into the universe. The other thing that intersects a little bit between being a rabbi and the beautiful game is that Major League Soccer has always been a place for asking big questions about what's right in society, right? So like when the George Floyd protests started and the athletes got involved in Black Lives Matter protests, like asking good, big questions about being a good human being and treating people with love and respect and just doing it from a soccer perspective. And it's not very different from my other work. It's great. It's a great thing to do. And I think also just the sheer awe and beauty and poetry of a upper 90 goal from 35 yards away. Like, you are moved. Like, all human beings who like soccer are moved. And we all call that a different thing. And I think that's a spiritual moment, as absurd as that sounds. But other people would just say, that was awesome. Let's get another pint, but I say, that's awesome. Let's get another pint. Praise be the Lord. Like, that's my reaction.
Well, I have been wanting to talk to you for a while, and so I'm super excited that we finally got the chance to do it. I hope we get to do it again because, hey, these teams play each other at least twice a year, right? So maybe we'll be able to get together the next time as well. The one and only soccer rabbi, Mark Goodman. Mark, anything else that I didn't get to mention about your work that you want to plug, or any content or anything else pregame or otherwise that you would like to point people to?
The best place to check out anything that I do is on Twitter. It's always retweeted there. So it's at soccer_rabbi. You can see it right on here if you're watching, but if you're listening, you can't see it. So right, because if you're out for a run right now, in the beautiful weather.
That's a good point. I don't do that very often. I usually point at the screen. There's the Twitter right there. Beautiful. So thank you for saying it.
Yeah, no, and by the way, I lived in the Bay Area for 5 years before I was in Colorado. So I was just this close, folks, to being soccer_rabbi, Jamon Moore's sidekick on the Epicenter podcast.
You were at one time Rapids rabbi, and I remember
right.
one day I changed to soccer rabbi, and I'm like, "Where did Mark go? I couldn't find you." It's like, "Oh, it's soccer rabbi now."
Very quickly, the best reason for that was there's a coach who was with FC Tucson, and now he's in the front office at Phoenix, and he's a Jewish guy who is a professional soccer coach, but is not a rabbi. But his Twitter handle for a very long time was Soccer Rabbi. And he gave up the handle one day to use his own name. And I wrote to him and I said, like, can I use your old handle? Because I'm actually a rabbi and I like soccer. And he was like, cool.
Not only that, you're in Pittsburgh and covering the Riverhounds too. So there's that.
Right. And that's been a lot of fun. It's nice to have your foot in both worlds. I also cover the Pitt women's soccer team. So I'm so lucky. I get to watch ACC soccer, which is so incredible. You know, like North Carolina comes to Pittsburgh like once a year, and I'm like so lucky to see these amazing players, the best in the country. It's a blast.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And again, I'm just super happy to have gotten to have you on the show finally. So fans, definitely follow Mark and check out his work at Holding the High Line, Pittsburgh Soccer Now, and make sure you follow him at @soccer_rabbi. Mark, thank you again. Looking forward to Quakes and Rapids from PayPal Park. It'll be a 7 p.m. Pacific start time. We will have the live post game and the press conference, of course, with Alex Cabello and at least one player after the game. And hey, Mark, I know it's super late on a Saturday night, but if you want to drop by the show, you are more than welcome to. We would love to have you if you're still awake.
If I'm still awake and sober, because
and functional to be able to talk soccer like probably after midnight on the East Coast. So unfortunately, a late game. One of the downsides of following a team in the Western Conference when you live on the East Coast, I'm sure.
It's true. So. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, fans. So again, make sure that you follow all the things that we just talked about there, and like, subscribe, and turn on the notifications so you'll know when these videos are coming in the future. Thanks again for tuning into the Aftershock. I'm Jamon Moore. He's Mark Goodman. We will catch you the next time. Take care.